We organize societies that have slaves into two types: slave societies and societies with slaves. Now, slave societies were societies where the slaves were constituted a large portion of the population, and slavery dominates the economy and culture. So this is true in the Chesapeake, that's Maryland, Virginia, and the southern colonies, the Carolinas and Georgia. And we have this definition when slaves become at that level, so that's around 1700 to 1865. The other type of society is the societies with slaves, and those are societies that happen to have slaves, but where slaves are incidental to the economy and culture, and that's more common in the northern colonies and some middle colonies, and by that I mean Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware. And this is true from about 1700 to 1865 as well. So here we have the breakdown of the percentage of slaves in each of the colonies at the time, just before the American Revolution. And so you can see that in the northern colonies, they're 1%, 2%, 3%, with the highest being New York at 12%. That's quite high for the North, but still not enough to completely change the economy and society. The slaves are still relatively incidental to that society, although it's getting close to that tipping point. That tipping point is about 20%. When slaves are about 20% of a population, that's the general accepted tipping point between a society with slaves to a slave society. And if you look further down, in Maryland is 32%, Virginia 42%, North Carolina 35%, South Carolina 61%, and Georgia 45%. Now, sometimes the slave percentage was higher. So in South Carolina, the slave population got up to close to 80% at different points in its history. Now, in other colonies, not North American colonies, the Caribbean colonies, the slave percentage was even higher. So in societies with slaves, in the sort of northern colonies, most slaves in these areas lived in urban areas. They worked for wealthy families as what we call domestics, cooks, cleaners, drivers, or they worked on docks as sailors. And so most of the sailors in early America were, in fact, African American slaves. Most slaves who lived in the North lived with their families who owned them. They often didn't have much of a family life. They didn't know many other slaves. There weren't many other slaves around. And they often acculturated into European culture. They learned the language. They adopted into customs. Now, they still celebrated. They had their own culture, but it was not as obvious in the North as in the South. So the few things that emerged in the North are things like Negro Election Day, which is a brief outlet of playing, drinking, dancing, where the slave population could come together, and they would elect kings and governors and judges in a way of making the lowliest people in society for one day the people on the top. And owners allowed this, the sort of English sort of encouraged this, because this one day of revelry meant that there was less problems the rest of the year. Now, if they worked as sailors, they often had very little access to women. These were all men who worked as sailors. They weren't as tightly controlled as those who lived in urban areas, and so there were more rebellions. But they also were a little bit less. They had a lot more freedom. So there was a couple major rebellions in New York, and one of the places where the population was large enough where they could organize. In 1712, there was a major rebellion in New York City, and 13 were burned at the stake. New York also had a rebellion in 1742, except it wasn't actually a rebellion. There's no evidence that a rebellion actually took place, but New Yorkers were so afraid that there was a rebellion that they also burned several slaves that they thought were rebelling at the stake. But there's no evidence that was actually a thing, that it was just a pure, they were just afraid that it was true. Now, in the West Indies and the Caribbean, it really is a slave society, and that's the extreme, where slaves constitute about 96% of the population there, and there's no family life at all. In fact, very few people survive long enough to have a family. They lived on average 3 to 5 years once they lasted in the West Indies. And it's because they grow sugar in the West Indies. It's very profitable and it's very deadly. The profits are worth bringing in lots of labor, working them to death, and then just replacing them. Don't worry. The planters didn't want to worry about making sure they were healthy or taken care of. They just brought over workers, had them work for a long time, and when they died, they just replaced them because sugar was so profitable in that way. In the West Indies, a third of the slaves died within the first 3 years of their arrivals. Of the 1.2 million slaves that were imported, by 1780 there was only 350,000 slaves. So there was a huge mortality rate. They also suffered a very low birth rate. Not only are there very few females, but there's poor nutrition and lots of infant mortality. So half the women in the West Indies never had any children at all. A quarter of the newborns died within 10 days, and that's both the disease and infanticide because they did not want those children. The mothers did not want those children to live that life. After emancipation in the 19th century, the population in the West Indies just skyrocketed when people were actually willing to have children again. In the West Indies, it's the hardest type of labor. It's gang labor, where slaves would be organized into teams and they would go along in rows doing a task, digging holes, planting, weeding, harvesting. If anyone lagged behind or stopped, the driver was supposed to whip them. And here we have a quote from a woman named Jane Shaw, who's an observer, describing this system, this gang labor system. The Negroes, who are all in troops, are sorted so as to match each other in size and strength. Every 10 Negroes have a driver who walks behind them, holding in his hand a short whip and a long one. They are naked, male and female, down to the girdle, and you constantly observe where application of the whip has been made. They would be as averse to whipping as we are, could it be avoided, which has often been tried to no purpose. When one comes to be better acquainted with the Negroes, the horror of it must wear off. As to the brutes, it inflicts no wound on their mind, whose nature seems made to bear it, and whose sufferings are not attended with shame or pain beyond the present moment. And you have to wonder what kind of situation or what kind of mind blindness this woman must have taken so that she could not see the suffering, that she could not see what this did to Africans and African Americans who were through this system. They didn't want to see this, so they just went into denial. And so here this woman is going into complete denial of what she sees. And of course, what slave would reveal their pain to this woman? Why would you reveal that to this woman who's an observer? So slaves outnumber whites in this area about 3 to 1. So they enact strict slave codes. So slave codes are laws to put slaves down, to keep them in their quote-unquote place. And it's often southern colonies, but also in the West Indies. And the idea was if slaves would be restricted as many ways as possible. So the slaves code would determine whether they could marry, who they could visit, if they could visit. If you had a child, what would the child would be kept as a slave. If the slave codes included if a white woman had a child that was black, right, that child, even though was not a slave, would have to be a servant for 31 years. So it was a power to punish freely, to restrict slaves as much as possible, and not just restrict slaves, but restrict Africans and African Americans as much as possible. Now, the Low Country, which is the South Carolina and Georgia, is what we call is a slave society, and they were also needed a constant influx of slaves to keep going. They had about 2 slaves for every white, but it was a much better system than what you had in the West Indies because it's a very marshy area and whites didn't want to live in these marshy areas. So the slaves often lived by themselves. They would have an overseer or a driver, but there wouldn't be many household slaves and there wouldn't be many whites. And they worked on the task system, which is do the work during the day. You have a task, do the work, and at the end of the day, if you did the task, the rest of the day is yours. So there's less oversight. The work is harder in many ways. The disease is higher, and there's many more maroon communities, communities of escaped slaves. But the communities of slaves, they developed their own culture. They kept many of their African ways, their names. They established their own language. In South Carolina, this is the language Gullah. Now there are some urban slaves, but they they can hire themselves out. Sometimes they make a profit, and some of the slaves in South Carolina made enough money they could buy their own freedom. And this is often the case of lighter-skinned slaves who may have developed more skills as being house slaves. In the Chesapeake, that's Maryland and Virginia, there was actually natural increase. There were more children born to slaves than were imported. Most of the slaves in Maryland and Virginia were better fed. They were less exposed to disease. Those two colonies only imported 250,000 slaves, but by 1780, it's 576. So this is a slave population where they did have children, and they were able to maintain those children. And they're about 40% of the population, which is enough to worry planters, but not to terrify them. So the slaves in these communities are able to preserve some African ways, not as much as in South Carolina. They also start adopting some European ways. So the Chesapeake is one of those places that's sort of in between, where those Africans and African Americans kept some African cultures, but also adopted some European cultures. They were the most likely to speak English and adopt evangelical Christianity.